How are Catholic parishes responding to this context? What is their desired future? How can we as theologians evaluate the self-understanding and response of Catholic parishioners from a theological point of view? And how can we as theologians support parishes pastorally so that their parish life, its structures and activities remain both culturally plausible, theologically valid? In order to answer my question in the field of pastoral theology, I've used a hermeneutical approach in a systematic, empirical and a practical way. I understand hermeneutics in pastoral theology as the art of interpretation. In that art of interpretation, the relationship between human experience and tradition is seen as important, so both are given attention. The relationship between human experience and tradition does not occur in a mono-correlational way, but in a multi-correlational way. And with careful attention can lead to a fusion of horizons where the two are put together in a new way. As Professor Dillon puts it, the hermeneutical approach gives attention to the gap as well as the bridge between experience and tradition, and it focuses on the multi-dimensional ways in which both experience and tradition can be interpreted. So in this hermeneutical approach, which I've tried to keep in mind throughout the thesis, it's the gap and the bridge and the multi-dimensional ways that the experience and tradition of parish life may be interpreted, and that's been my focus. So in light of a new context and with a hermeneutical approach, I proposed a typology that suggests that there may be different ways of understanding a parish. From scripture and tradition, I've given weight to koinonia, community, communio, to diakonia, service, kerygma, proclamation and learning, liturgy. And in this process developed SPES as a way of reflecting on the current identity of the parish and its prospects for the future. I've also proposed a theological normative position, taking into account the context, the tradition, scripture, tradition, the multi-loci of theology to arrive at this point. And the theological normative position for SPES is the engaged parish. So let's look at SPES. We look at SPES, the typology which is at the heart of the thesis. SPES is built around two axes. The first axis is the vertical axis, public and private. This axis represents the tension line that exists for religion today, and specifically for parish life, and whether or not religion is relegated to the private realm, or whether it takes its place in the public realm with a public function and role. The public-private axis is where the relegation of religion to the private sphere is questioned today. It's the axis on which the secularization theory is also questioned. The second axis is the proclamation dialogue axis. And this axis represents a shift from a world where it was once impossible not to believe in God to one where belief in God is one option among many. At the proclamation end of the axis, we have a point which presumes belief is unproblematic, taken for granted. The time-honoured traditions and dogmatic teachings of the Church can be presented in a clear, unambiguous and binding way. At the other end of the axis is dialogue, and dialogue here represents both dialogue ad intra and ad extra. It's aware that a believing position is not always the easiest one to hold. It understands that God's address to humanity calls for a response. At the intersection of these two axes, four quadrants emerge. I've named them the convinced, the engaged, the consumerist and the devoted parish. The convinced parish, actively promoting the Catholic faith for all, both inside and outside the parish. The engaged parish, searching to be a parish through religiously inspired engagement in a pluralist environment. The consumerist parish, seeking relevance by providing religious services for a variety of personal, religious and spiritual needs. The devoted parish, seeking to remain Catholic by endorsing the cultic and devotional practices of the Church together with other parishioners. Each type has its own strengths and weaknesses. No one parish reflects the type totally. SPES is a model, and it's designed to throw light on parish life, not to box people into categories. It's meant to open up conversations and dialogue, not to shut them down. Each of the categories, each of the parish types has been developed with a number of characteristics representing them. SPES also has a theological normative position, the engaged parish. The normative position sits on the public side of private-public. It also sits on the dialogue side of proclamation dialogue. It recognises the positive contributions of each parish type. It is the parish, however, that knows that a reflective and engaged approach with both experience and tradition can continue to be adaptive and capable of self-renewal. SPES has been developed into a multivariate attitudinal scale, a survey. It's a dual measurement scale looking for attitudes from respondents in relation to their actual and their ideal parish. It's administered currently as a 64-item Likert scale survey with responses from 1 to 7, strongly disagree to strongly agree. In a moment, I'll look at the survey results from a group of parishes from Melbourne and then from Flanders. In this research, as well as testing SPES, I've also included the post-critical belief scale and the Melbourne scale in my research. These scales have been used in research into the identity of Catholic schools and have been validated elsewhere. Today, I'll present two sets of results. The first is the combination of the aggregate data from 3 parishes in Melbourne. The second will be from the data from the 5 parishes and 11 federations who participated in Flanders. We first turn to the SPES scale means, or average scores. So the graph that we're looking at the moment shows the parish types: convinced, engaged, consumerist, devoted. And on the left-hand side, the blue bars, is that your left? The left-hand side, the blue bars show the factual situation, how people actually see their parish. And on the right-hand side, the green bars show the ideal parish. The graph shows on the factual level, the left-hand set of bars in blue, that all 4 parishes are recognised as characterising the parish. That's how it is. The most agreement is that the parish is recognised as engaged. It's also consumerist. It's a little recognised as convinced and devoted. The parishes are more supportive of the parish types on the dialogue side of the SPES scale, engaged and consumerist. When we look at the ideal level, we see a slightly different pattern. Here we see an increase in 2 types, the engaged and the convinced, a levelling off on one, the consumerist, a decrease in another, the devoted. The clear preference on the ideal level is for the engaged parish. We can also observe a gap between how parishes see themselves on the factual level and how they would like to be on the ideal level. The next 2 slides show us the results are not the same in all parishes. These results show the SPES averages or means disaggregated to each parish. Each colour, brown, red and yellow, represent a different parish. The profile is slightly different for each. On the normative level, there are also differences, although we can see an agreed favouring for the engaged parish on the ideal level. I mentioned that I also used the post-critical belief scale and the Melbourne scale and found that there were correlations between SPES and these 2 scales. What we're seeing now is an intercorrelation graph, also known as a bubble graph. The post-critical belief scale are down the rows of this graph and show intercorrelations between SPES and post-critical belief. I'll point out a couple of significant correlations. First, we can see that literal belief correlates with the convinced parish and the devoted parish. We also see that external critique and relativism both correlate with the consumerist parish, and post-critical belief with the engaged parish. A second set of correlations was undertaken with the Melbourne scale. Briefly, the convinced parish correlates with reconfessionalising and a values education approach. The engaged parish correlates with recontextualising. The consumerist parish with secularisation, the devoted parish with reconfessionalisation and values education. Most of this is not surprising. However, one of the major insights is that the desire for the convinced parish seems to be based on the hope that the monocorrelational approach of linking faith with culture can still work in both schools and parishes. This is an approach that we'll see repeated in the Belgian data. A second major trial took place in Belgium. The findings are presented here by way of comparison with the Melbourne Parishes data. Once again, we see, if we look at the blue bars on the left-hand side of the Belgian data, that all 4 parishes are recognised by respondents. Of note is the low score for the engaged parish in the Belgian data. Also is the difference in the ideal level. Whereas the Melbourne parishes opt for the engaged parishes, the Belgian parishes respondents prefer a combination of engaged and convinced on the normative level. The Melbourne parishes opt for the engaged, the Belgian parishes preferred a combination of engaged and convinced. It seems that respondents are seeking to be engaged in a convinced way. But both groups opt for the parish in the public side of SPES. This will be an ongoing challenge for these parishes. Both groups, Melbourne and Belgium, show a healthy post-critical belief, with the Belgian parish groups showing slightly more higher literal belief. Both groups show a desire to recontextualise the school, with Melbourne parishes being slightly more wary of values education and uncertain about reconfessionalising. Belgian parishioners are more in favour of those 2 approaches. Finally, once again, we see that in the correlations between SPES and the Melbourne scale, the convinced parish correlates with reconfessionalising and values education. In other words, there's a hope that the monocorrelational approach of linking faith with life will still be effective. In summary, Melbourne parishes showed the stronger support on the post-critical belief scale for post-critical belief, the stronger support on the Melbourne scale for recontextualising, and the stronger support on SPES for the engaged parish. Belgian parishes showed the stronger support on the post-critical belief scale for the post-critical belief, the stronger support on the Melbourne scale for recontextualising, and the stronger support on SPES for a combination of the convinced and the engaged parish. The fourth part of my thesis was to provide some practical theological instruments to assist in the reflection of parishes on their ideal parish and the movement from the factual to the ideal. These I have looked at: building koinonia, reflecting on the parish vision, reflecting on leadership, exploring leadership styles, churches in dialogue, approaches and attitudes towards dialogue, interfaith and interreligious, community in dialogue, approaches and attitudes towards dialogue with worldviews within the community, exploring new contexts for kerygma, particularly looking at different approaches and attitudes to evangelization, diversifying diaconia, how understanding service today, contemplating and celebration of liturgy, beauty and the spiritual life. Challenges still remain and opportunities exist in parish life today. For parishes and schools to work together, for self-reflection, to engage in future planning, for leadership of parishes, for using SPES in the wider context of pastoral planning, for reflection on the structural changes which are inevitable and are happening, for a renewed focus on the role of the laity, for dialogue as a theological and cultural imperative, for nurturing of post-critical belief, for a continued place for the territorial parish. It is my hope that SPES might be able to contribute to creatively reflecting on the church in the world today and of being part of the recovery of the original freshness of the gospel as it is lived out in parish life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anders Reed. I now give the floor to the promoter, Professor Didier Pollefeit. Professor Didier Pollefeit is full professor at our Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. He is an expert in the Jewish-Christian relations and in post-Holocaust theology. He is currently the Vice Rector for Education Policy, and in the context of this doctoral dissertation, it should be said that he is the founder of Thomas, a Catholic internet project for religious education sponsored by the Belgian Bishops' Conference the Office for Catholic Education Flanders and our faculty, and as part of that type of work, this doctoral dissertation is prepared and guided by him. Professor Pollefeit, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dean. Dear candidates, dear Father Reed, today many lines of our histories come together at this moment and in this place. Just to mention a few: schools and parishes, research and church life, systematic and practical theology, parishes in Flanders and in Victoria, the Office for Catholic Education and the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, Melbourne and Leuven, the cultures of Australia and Europe, even now connected at this very moment through online video streaming. But also the encounter of generations taking responsibility for Catholic identity, the legacy of the past, the power of the present, and our hopes for the future. At the crossroads of all these dynamics of the last 15 years, Father Brendan Reed has always been present, creating time and again new bridges and opening new avenues, never losing sight from his goal and mission: how to create an understanding of Catholic identity that is at the same time culturally plausible and theologically legitimate. And today, Brendan, you are standing here in our midst with your own academic contribution to this ongoing research dynamic on Catholic identity. A scale to measure the identity of parishes, the SPES scale. So new that our Library of Theology, and you can show the picture, put SPES prophetically on its outer wall, as you can see. After finishing his secondary school, Brendan Reed entered the Provincial Seminary of Victoria and Tasmania in 1983, and he was ordained in 1990. He obtained his STB in Theology in 1988 at Catholic Theological College, Melbourne, and his STL in 1996 at Gregorian University in Rome. In that same year, he came for the first time to KU Leuven for his Master in Religious Studies. He obtained a degree in 1997 with a master's thesis on the implication for religious education in society in light of Vatican II. His promoter was Professor Herman Lombard, also present here today. At the same time, he was supply priest of the English community of the University Parish in Leuven. In 1997, Brendan went back to Australia and started to work for the Office of Catholic Education in Melbourne, where he became Deputy Director for Schools in 2005. It is in this position that, together with Monsignor Tom Doyle, also present here, and Susan Pascoe, he negotiated the research program with KU Leuven that would come later, the Enhancing Catholic School Identity Project. With the continuous support of Mr. Steve Elder, the Executive Director of the Catholic Education Office in Victoria, Melbourne, the project became an immense success, with now more than 1,000 Catholic schools in its program, not only in Melbourne, but across the state of Victoria, the rest of Australia, and around the world. In the course of EXIP, it became clear that Catholic identity is not only a growing challenge for Catholic schools, but that parishes also come under pressure more and more. New questions arose on the relation between Catholic schools and parishes. Brendan came back to KU Leuven for the Master of Advanced Studies in Theology and Religious Studies, and he obtained a degree in 2010 with a master's thesis on the topic under the title, "What Future for Whose Parish?" The SPES scale was born. But SPES was then still a baby. The scale didn't work well empirically. It was a need for further foundations theologically. And from a pastoral perspective, the real question was how to implement a scale in everyday parish life. In 2011, Brendan started his doctorate from abroad in combination with parish work at home to further develop the empirical, systematic and pastoral aspects of the SPES scale. Last year, His Grace, Archbishop Hart from Melbourne, gave him a 6-month sabbatical to finish the manuscript. In the meanwhile, Brendan began lecturing on this subject at Australian Catholic University, Yarra Theological Union, and Catholic Theological College in Melbourne. He published his work in international journals like The Challenge and The Person, and in the Flemish journal Collationis, with the local church media taking interest in his work. I remember Brendan still very well the first day I was in Australia. It's almost 10 years ago. It was on Friday, September the 1st, 2006. I was a guest in your new house, the parish house of Our Lady of Good Counsel in Deepdene, Melbourne. In fact, you had just changed from a job at the Office for Catholic Education to the parish of Deepdene, teaching me to appreciate my first glass of Australian Shiraz. We were sitting in an almost empty house, surrounded by unpacked cardboard boxes. At that moment, I think we were not aware of the dynamics that would develop of our collaboration between Melbourne and Leuven. The next day, you invited me to the first Mass you would do at Deepdene Parish. I still remember this Eucharist with a very welcoming and vibrant community, with young and old, also closely connected with the parish school. Liturgia, Kerygma, Koinonia, Diaconia, all reflecting the spirit of Vatican II. In fact, it reminded me of my own childhood in the parish life of the 70s in Flanders, when the spirit of Vatican II was so tangible in even the smallest village. It was like coming home. Later on, I would experience the same Vatican II spirit in the Catholic schools in Victoria. From such a rich context of real lived parish life, this doctorate was born and written. The PhD you present here today brings into focus four perspectives from three different theologies: systematic, empirical, and pastoral. I am happy that this is also reflected in the Board of Examiners, and moreover a board with a very good gender balance. Congratulations to the Dean and the faculty for that. The research is presented in 4 parts, 17 chapters and 516 pages, included more than 200 pages with statistical underpinnings. The first part starts from the most recent sociological literature and the way theologians have tried to reformulate the position of Christianity and the Catholic Church in the midst of plurality and globalization. The second part starts from 2 dimensions that are crucial for the self-understanding of the parish today: its role in public and private life, and its orientation towards proclamation and dialogue. On the basis of these 2 axes, you reveal 4 theological parish types. It will be your lifelong duty and our fate to explain to people that these are theoretical constructs that can only be found to a certain degree and in changing combinations in real life. On the basis of central documents of Vatican II, you develop a nuanced, preferred theological position for the engaged parish. It is surprising also in the exit research that such a normative stance becomes less and less evident, also in theology, even if theology is a normative science. I appreciate your courage to engage in this debate on preferential normative positions in practical theology, even if, as we will see, complicated and controversial. The third part shows the growing validity of the SPES scale on empirical grounds. This part illustrates that this PhD has not been a walk in the park. Altogether, we needed 7 trials, both in Australia and Belgium, to make the scale work adequately. I saw you fighting with despair, when time and again we needed to reformulate items. But finally, you won the battle. The fourth and the last part of this thesis develops practical theological instruments on topics such as leadership, interreligious dialogue, Bible didactics, and liturgy. In line with the hermeneutical communicative model, the parish is understood as a hermeneutical space and the pastor as witness, specialist, and moderator. The last chapter presents a manual to teach the community to read, to interpret, and to work with the SPES data. In all of this, I would like to underline the unique contribution of this research to the field of practical theology. It takes up the shift from secularization to pluralization regarding the context of the future of parishes in Australia. The SPES typology as a theoretical construct to analyze parishes is unique, as is the development of a scale that is empirically valid and that shows that types exist in real parish life. Of course, again, always in a certain mix. Given the double measurement level, SPES not only allows us to understand parishes as they are today, but also as they will develop into the future. Because of the correlations of the Melbourne and Victoria scale, the doctorate also gives us new insights and perspectives for the future relations between parishes and schools. The practical theological instruments offer tools for parishes to hit the ground running with SPES. Dear promovendus, I know how hard you have been working in the last years. You had to combine your doctoral work with running a very lived and engaged parish, and you had to travel between 2 continents. You never lost your warm interest in people, your sense of humor, your social character, your cheerfulness, and your love for life. Traveling around Australia last year, I remember a quote from Jan Bowens, who said, I quote, "In Australia, everyone knows Brendan Reid." I can witness that Brendan is not a mere devotional academic, nor is he a consumerist of other people's ideas, nor someone only convinced of his own truth. Rather, Brendan is fully engaged, a truly human person concerned with the well-being of others. Dear Brendan, I would like to thank you for our collaboration in the past years. It was an honor for me to be a promoter. I hope that we can continue our collaboration through your work at CTC, ACU, and the Office for Catholic Education in Melbourne. But before that, I want to use the opportunity to ask you my final question as a promoter. And I need another slide for that. One of the most revealing moments of the research was when we analyzed and discussed the correlations between the SPES scale and the Melbourne scale. It was in this building, on the 2nd floor. You must remember that moment. We saw strong correlations between values education and reconfessionalization with the convinced parish on the one hand, and very strong correlation between the engaged parish and recontextualization on the other hand. And here we found the key to understand the factor of the convinced parish and its success, also in Flanders, as you have shown today, that has surprised us time and again. Here we also found the deepest divides in the parish strategies. The convinced parish that tried to bridge the gap between faith and culture through values education in order to reconfessionalize, and the engaged parish that leaves behind this monocorrelational strategy and radically chooses to recontextualize its identity without immediate reconfessionalizing intentions. That's also what you see on the graph. My question is, would you then agree that the parishes are confronted with the same challenges as the schools, namely how to move to a dialogical model of identity and from values education to recontextualization, and that this movement will be of importance for the future alliance between schools and parishes? And if this is the case, what would that imply for the self-definition and the concrete pastoral life of parishes in the future? That's my really last question to you, Brendan.
First of all, thank you very much for your laudatio. The question about, the shift from a monocorrelational approach of immediate linking faith and life to a dialogue approach. I think it's clear from the data that the parishes and schools are facing similar issues in the challenge for the desire, in a school's case, to recontextualize, in a parish case, to engage, with the desire to still hang on to the monocorrelational approach. would it be a challenge? Is it one of the challenges? Your question you're asking, is it something that needs to be addressed before the alliance of school and parish can come into effect? I actually think that the task could be the way for the alliance to happen, because I think that the two can parishes and schools can actually help each other in this way. I'm thinking particularly of the results for parishioners in Melbourne to the Melbourne scale. And I think we saw in that data that the parishioners who participated in those surveys, the respondents, showed the highest level of a desire for recontextualising their Catholic school than the group of adults, teachers and parents in primary schools in Melbourne. It was a counterintuitive discovery because people would tell me that our schools and our parishes are more likely to be literal believers wanting to reconfessionalise the school. In fact, the Melbourne data showed that wasn't the case, and there was much more caution against the monocorrelational approach in the parish data than there is in the school data. So it could be that this very question coming to the fore could help to actually forge the alliance between schools and parishes. I think there's an underestimation of what each can contribute to each other in the discussion.
Would you say the same for Flanders, as we have seen the results?
For the Flemish data, it's interesting that there was still more confidence or more desire for the school to recontextualise, but also in combination with values education and reconfessionalising. I think for me the insight there was the difference in some of the historical differences in Belgium and Australia. It comes out in the Melbourne scale, which in Flanders is a V. The situation of the change from the world of Christendom to a world of pluralisation is different in the Australian context, in that the very beginnings of Australia there was already a separation of church and state. I think that has some impact on there's some way of explaining the difference. The challenges, however, I think are the same. Whether the schools and parishes have drifted in different, whether there's still enough commonality to bring them back together is a question. I'm not sure, but I think SPES can help.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Pollefeit. I now give the floor to the first corrector, Professor Robin Horner. Professor Horner is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University of Melbourne. She is a connoisseur of the French philosophy, Jean-Luc Marion, Emmanuel Levinas, Jacques Derrida. She has published a lot of things on systematic theology, on post-structuralism and the like. And today she is present in Leuven, and we feel honored by her presence. We not only have the voices from Flanders, but now we will also have a voice from Australia. Welcome in Leuven, the floor is yours.
Firstly, thank you, Dean Lambert, for your very warm welcome in Leuven and for the privilege of being part of this doctoral defence. Congratulations, Brendan. This work, having read your thesis, displays the extraordinary breadth of the toil. What a lot of work has gone into it on 2 continents over so many years, and managing so many different and competing factors and interpretations. So congratulations on getting to this point.
Thank you.
It's truly an honour to be here and to be part of this defence. Questions should never be taken as a negative. They should always be taken as a positive. and this is the place for engagement in the academy around the questions that you raise in the thesis. So while I have many questions, I'll try to limit them to 3 in the short time that we have available. Firstly, Brendan, I'm very interested in the fact that in your research, a high number of respondents seem to score strongly on the post-critical belief scale. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that this pattern of believing is theologically literate. When I say that, I'm really wondering to what extent people recognise themselves when they respond to the surveys, but without necessarily being able to articulate many of the features that actually form the background of post-critical belief. And so for me, the challenge in all of this research, both the EXI research with the schools and the SPES research with the parishes, lies around the capacity for the dialogue to have a theological depth. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think people are responding out of recognition or out of a deep understanding of what post-critical belief might be, and how does that need to be managed in the context of SPES? That's the first question.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for your laudatio. Thank you for reading so carefully and engaging with my text. The question of post-critical belief and the respondents' engagement with the scale. I'd say broadly, with all the scales, whether it's SPES, whether it's post-critical belief, whether it's the Melbourne scale, what we're looking for in respondents on the attitudinal scale is an intuitive response, an immediate intuitive response of do I agree with this or don't I agree with this? We're not asking respondents to pull the questions apart, to analyse them, to, as you know, to give an explanation of what sits behind them, but to give their immediate reaction. It's a spontaneous reaction that is then, whether you would say to someone before they undertook the post-critical belief scale, are you a post-critical believer? Possibly they would not have any response to that question at all. In fact, probably better that they don't know what they're going to be asked. Are you a literal believer? Are you a post-critical believer? Are you a relativist? I think, again, the point is not to try and categorise people into those particular boxes. That's always a danger, but I don't think that that's the point of the question. I think it's to get a spontaneous reaction so that we can get a profile, and what we do in SPES and in ICSI is to get a profile of the institution. After all, that with the schoolwork and the parish work, I think we're looking for the institutional identity and the tendencies that exist in that institution for the way that the cognitive believing style is operative. I think, though, your question then, what do we do with that? How do we work through it? I think is an important question, and I think part of the key, and that I started grappling with near the end of the thesis, was the parish as a hermeneutical space, where it does require, within a parish, as within a school institution, that there are some experts, that there are some people who can moderate. I think if I use the example of what's become much more popular in parishes and communities of faith today is the Lectio Divina. You could ask the question, is it possible that we could actually understand and delve into the scriptures without having all the tools that are necessary for historical critical understanding of the scriptures? I think clearly not everybody needs those. They can still enter into a process of Lectio Divina without having all of that knowledge. But somebody who leads the group needs to have done some work. Somebody needs to understand that in order to engage with the group. I would say that in parishes and in schools, that's a big challenge. Leadership, capacity of those who are leading and moderating and witnessing in schools and in parish life. I think, however, it's too important not to do. It's too important not to take up that challenge, so that the parish who is the parish that is not reflective or not engaging on that level is not going very far.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you're right that this is too important not to do. And I think, in fact, what you've done with the thesis is provide a means of beginning that reflection. Yeah. I think it's a crucial reflection, in fact. In the parishes and the schools, we stand at a point where this is crucial work to be done. But my challenge to you going forward is to really think about that development of literacy, because it seems to me that will be crucial for this, either as a long-term project or as something that comes and goes. Yeah. And that what we need is the longer-term development of people, which won't all be at the same level, certainly, and we'll need experts, but we also need people to develop their capacity even to reflect in that manner. A second question. I'm conscious that you constantly say through the thesis that it's important that we don't box people into these types, and I completely agree with you, and having been part of a culture where we are talking about exi, and where the language of recontextualisation is, that's now a buzzword. We need to be very careful that these don't become jargon words. Is there a danger in the types of caricature? And particularly, I'm thinking about when we look at the engaged type, it seems to me that empirically you discovered in the engaged type an understanding of sin as primarily structural. There was a focus on social justice, which does accord, in my experience, with people who would be of this perhaps view or attitude. But in the theological normative position, have you sufficiently allowed for a corrective to that? I wonder if in the thesis there's a sense that the engaged type is perhaps a little bit too rosy in its empirical state, and that perhaps there are correctives too for the engaged type so that it doesn't become a caricature.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Okay, so about, I think if I've understood your question correctly, then you're talking about the engaged type as a theoretical construct and also on the empirical level. Yeah, I think the task of creating types is always a dangerous one. Working with models is always a dangerous one. And I think what I would underline, and what I think Professor Poliford outlined in his initial response, that we will spend the rest of our lives underlining is that we're not trying to put people in boxes. Yeah? We're not trying to put people in boxes. We're trying to create models that will throw light on the whole. In creating the models, again, I would say they don't exist in reality. They don't exist as a media replica of reality. They don't exist as a mirror of reality. So, yeah, I would say they have to be understood as types. If I pick out perhaps your example of social justice and structural sin, I don't think, for example, that excludes in the type that there is a personal responsibility and personal, such a thing as personal sin and a break in relationship with God and the other. However, I think in creating the types, we're looking for particular tendencies right across that type in a whole range of categories, as you can see I've done throughout the thesis. that creation of the model then feeds into questions, and is it recognisable? And then that comes, it's an organic process when the empirical then comes back. I would say, actually, that I think in the empirical results that the respondents actually say, no, the engaged parish doesn't exist in a rosy state. That's part of the feedback from the empirical, that very strongly in the Belgian data, the engaged parish exists alongside their convinced parish, and it's desirable that that be so. So I think actually the empirical is continually doing the correction of the theological, and the theological then is again reflecting on the empirical.
So that in fact, in, for example, proposed work with parishes, presenting results, talking about instruments, having people work with these, there's going to be a constant need theologically to break this open far more deeply around how the engaged, well, the theological normative actually sits much closer to the centre, that it's not identified entirely with the engaged type.
That the empirical
No, in
normative.
fact, that the theological normative would be something that is quite close actually to the centre, not simply mirroring what an engaged parish at the empirical or at the theoretical level is, but something. Yeah,
because my normative point is actually right down on the public-private, on the in that little corner, still touching those other parishes. Perhaps, and for a parish, I think that's the right place.
And so
perhaps for another institution, the normative position is somewhere else. For example, political theology, I think it goes somewhere else.
And each of these questions, we could talk about for a long time, but I will move to my third one just because I'm conscious that the time is pressing. The relativist, the consumerist parish, where we have our relativists who, as you say, believe in everything and therefore believe in nothing, which can be very true. There's another interpretation of that would make relativists pluralists, religious pluralists. I'm thinking of someone like John Hick, where all religious traditions are valid, not simply because anything goes, but more because, Hick or his descendants now would talk about, ways to ultimate truth, for example. So is there room in the model for a relativist who isn't simply someone who doesn't believe in anything, but who actually has that different approach? I'm not necessarily theologically endorsing that, but I'm just wondering, in your thinking through of that approach, whether that's something that you've thought about.
The relativist who doesn't necessarily believe...
Who's a pluralist?
Who's a pluralist?
A genuine pluralist.
Yeah. I think in the consumerist quadrant, there is definitely a place for the pluralist. I think in the typology of the consumerist, what we see is that there are correlations with relativism on the post-critical belief scale. We see that there are associations with consumerist parish and relativism. But I don't think those associations are necessarily cause and effect, or that those associations are necessarily hold true for every element, every part of the consumerist quadrant. I think one of the positive things that the consumerist quadrant actually offers, and it's one that I've come to appreciate more throughout the research, is that it really opens the space for those who are on a search, for those who are seekers, and for those who might be doing that in a pluralist way, for those who are not sure, for those who are coming in and out of the faith, for those who for a time find that this is the place for them, and that that the parish is the place that holds things together for them in their life for this moment, but then are gone again. I think that quadrant of the consumerist, and of course it's never just that. Yeah, I think that's there's room there, and that's a helpful suggestion actually, to actually name that pluralist style specifically. I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Brendan, thank you, and I know the conversation will continue, or I hope it will, over coffee in Australia. Dean Lammerett, I'm conscious that my time has probably come to an end, so thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Horner. Now I give the floor to the second corrector, Professor Mark Steen. Mark Steen is a professor of Pastoral Theology at our Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. He is also the rector of the Johannes 23 Seminary here in Leuven. The Johannes 23 Seminary is the major seminary of the Belgian Archdiocese. It is also affiliated to our Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. In other words, Professor Steen is involved in the training of future leaders in the Church, and this is one of the main reasons why he has read this dissertation, not only with academic, but also with pastoral interest. Professor Steen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Dear Brendan, first of all, I want to congratulate you with the completion of your doctoral dissertation. It's a special day for you, your friends, family, and also for your parish and diocese in Australia. I know that it's not at all evident to write a doctoral dissertation when you are simultaneously busy as a parish priest, but you succeeded in doing it. I was always happy to meet you here in Leuven and to share our experiences as priests. It was also a joy for me that you always were ready to give a presentation of your research in my course on practical ecclesiology. Myself and the students have really appreciated this. We will miss your sympathetic presence and contributions. You have written a well-documented, very coherent and fluent dissertation on a very important topic. Your dissertation is also original. You have done an empirical research on different parish types, and you are able to combine it with systematic hermeneutic and pastoral hermeneutic reflections on being church and being a parish today. The intercorrelations between SPES and post-critical belief scale and the Melbourne scale are fascinating. Your research is also very useful and relevant at the level of pastoral practice. It's offering interesting tools and orientations for self-reflection by parishes. In sum, your research is an inspiring contribution to contemporary theology on the Church in general and parishes in particular. It's also my role as a corrector to bring in some critical remarks and some questions. My first series of questions deal with the normative position of your dissertation. Reading your dissertation, I come to believe that probably, I don't know, but probably a kind of partnership between the convinced parish and the engaged parish is desirable. Is a dialogue model yet sufficient in a radical pluralized society? Should the dialogue model not be completed with more confessional shapes of faith and church? So, in other words, is a more thoroughgoing paradigm shift not required in our society? The respondents of your research are all rather old and are strongly engaged in parishes. But what about the younger generations? Is your option for an engaged parish not dependent on the question whether there will be a sufficient number of engaged and very convinced parishioners in the future? It's my conviction that an initiation model according to which Christians, and especially also young Christians, have to be initiated gradually into Christian faith and communities will become more and more important in the future. Linked to that question, in your normative position, you also try to integrate the values of different parish types. But it's not so clear to me in what manner it may happen. Are these types compatible with each other? A lot of questions. You can select.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for those questions and challenges. They are. So let me start with the normative position of a partnership between the convinced and the engaged. It's hard to dispute that on the empirical level, that's there in the latest data. That combination is there. I think, however, one of the challenges for that will be the underlying approach to convinced and engaged. This approach of the convinced that still believes that there can be almost an immediate and an easy link between faith and culture on the one hand, and the engaged parish which is more open to an open dialogue in which it's not immediately necessary to reconfessionalize or convert those in their midst. And I think ultimately there will be, with the combination of those two types, that's going to be something that has to be unraveled. Whether it's possible to do that, I think time will tell. I think that we'll need to, in any particular parish, those issues will need to come to the fore. I think that's one of the things that SPES has given us. The changed cultural context, I think, applies to all parishioners, no matter what age. I mean, I think you're right. The respondents across Melbourne and across Flanders represent the age of churchgoers. They were the people who responded, and they are in their average 60 and above. I have to say during the research that I've also gained an enormous amount of respect for those people who have taken part. They are in many ways in Australia, and I think in Flanders too, the backbone of what happens in parish life. I think there's sociologically a new category of those who are not going to retire after they reach 60. They're the portfolioers, and they take on different roles in their lives, looking after family, sometimes committing to parish and other, etc. So a lot of respect for those people. I'm also reminded of the work that was done through the project, the Spirit of Generation Y in Australia, looking at the spirituality of Generation Y with a control group of older people. And their conclusion was that the issues facing the young are the same issues facing the old. In fact, this is not an age effect, but a period effect. It's the period that we're living in through, and everyone is going through similar issues, similar challenges. Will they be there in the future? Yeah, and that's part of my question. Will there be a future for the parish in Melbourne, and I know in Flanders as well? There is restructuring of parishes happening constantly. In fact, even yesterday, the diocese of one of the priests from the Diocese of Ghent was telling me we are going for a new structure of federations now. But my underlying question for all of that is, well, what type of parish will it be, no matter what the structure? Where will people be able to find a place of working it out, of being accompanied, the ability to discover, to disclose, to learn. I still think it's the engaged parish. I still think that normative position, I still think it's that parish. Again, it's that parish, it's that engaged parish with the normative position on the scale where it is, that doesn't dismiss or relegate other expressions or other parish types, but I think it beckons them forward. Yeah, have I answered? Yeah.
Second question. Thank you, Brendan. It's interesting to recognize different parish profiles and types. Nevertheless, the broader perspective and dynamics of the local church, the diocese, seems also to be relevant and very important. You are mentioning this aspect very briefly at the end of your dissertation. Diversity is important, but also a certain unity in diversity. Otherwise, a real common dynamics will lack. The pastoral theologian Wissink is comparing it with a cardiac arrest. A cardiac arrest is due to very active, different movements without coordination. That's the risk of uncoordinated different movements and dynamics, probably also in ecclesial contexts. The result is not a positive élan, but the risk of a standstill, an arrest.
Well, I can't disagree with you. I think...
some ideas on that, the correlation between dioceses and parishes.
Yeah, it's a very important question. And it's a very challenging question. Because I think often in the changed cultural context, the reality is that not only on the ground, but also at the level of diocesan authorities, sometimes it's not so obvious what to do. It's not clear what to do. Nobody actually has the blueprint anymore. And I think that's the struggle. I think what I set out to do with SPES in a hermeneutical way was to let the voices from the ground come forward. That was my first objective, I think, to hear, to understand, to know what the voices of parishioners had to say, where they stood. I think for diocesan planning, it can be really important research, important work. Some of the intuitive beliefs about what's happening in parishes and the profile of parishioners and the way that they put life together and the way that they act in their parish, I think have been uncovered and found not to be true in this research. For example, I think when I was often working with schools in the early day of the Enhancing Catholic School Identity Project, teachers would often say to me, but this is not, we can't recontextualize our school because our parish will hold us back, because the parishioners will be literal believers and wanting us to reconfessionalize the school. So I think there's evidence there to say, in fact, there's a different profile there of parishioners. There's a readiness there with parishioners to do something else. There's a desire to really move into the public side of the SPES, into the SPES model. So I think the first my approach would be to go slowly, to actually listen and make sure that the voices of those in parishes who are keen, I have to say, that was my experience in doing this research, who are very keen to respond, to have their say, to tell you what they think, to answer surveys, that sifting through and listening to those voices can be a way of feeding into diocesan policy and diocesan planning. Yep, there does need to be some way of coordinating, bringing that together, some vision. I think some dioceses do it better than others. Some are under the way of having diocesan plans, diocesan councils that feed into those plans, and I think here's another possibility for information to come forward.
Thank you very much, Professor Steen. I now give the floor to the third corrector, Professor Annemie Dille. Professor Dille is professor in Pastoral and Empirical Theology. As you can see, there is some consistency in this board of examiners. We have a rector of a major seminary, we have an Australian colleague, we have an expert in empirical theology. Moreover, Professor Dille is very much involved in research on families and children and religious education in families. Professor Dille, you have the floor.
Dear Brendan, congratulations on your dissertation. I think your work can be considered a very rich contribution to theology, to the academy in general, to the church and to society. I think your work reads as a profound synthesis of empirical and theological insights. It's a synthesis in which you unwrap a whole complex of issues in relation to the daily challenges of parish life. And you're touching new and fairly undiscovered ground with your dissertation. And you did this in addition to your many other duties in Australia, so congratulations for all this work. I will name some strengths of the dissertation, and then I will ask you some questions in order to give you the opportunity to persuade me and the audience of your quality as an academic theologian, although I think there's no doubt about it. Your PhD contains many chapters, so 17 to be precise, and the advantage of all these chapters is that the logical structure of your PhD becomes immediately clear to the reader. The work reads very fluidly as a whole, and the appendixes illustrate the results as discussed in the main body of the text. So I think you managed to bring a lot of material together in a rather condensed form. So your 312 pages are more or less our limit in Leuven, but I recognize that you could have written much more even. So I value the way in which you were able to bring all these different theological insights together in a way that supports the reader. I also appreciate the many examples you give, as well as the reflections on recent developments within the Church. And of course, I also appreciate how you develop ways to stimulate new practices and reflection in parishes. So your PhD is based on theological reflections on foundation of literature with the integration of your own experience. And next to this theoretical approach, you conducted extensive quantitative empirical research in Flanders and in Australia, of course. I know how difficult it is to develop your own instrument. So you and the whole team under the supervision of Professor Didier Pollefeit and Jan Bouwens deserve to be praised for these efforts and for the final results. It was enriching to reach your PhD and the models you developed theoretically and empirical, as I agree with most of your insights, and I truly value the combinations of these many aspects brought together in your typology, especially from my point of view also the inclusion of the role of children in parishes. So I worked myself with the same supervisor as you, and although that's 10 years ago, I recognize his empirical methodology, but also the synthetic style of writing and thinking. So for sure, your promoter shares in my congratulations. But it's you, of course, who have written this profound work in a whole new field with the subsequent new challenges along your way. And so now it's you who have to answer my questions. I'm wrestling myself with these questions. So they are not just, there's not just one possible answer, I would say, in a hermeneutical mind. You speak about a normative position. So there we have it again. The normative position in relation to the different scales. I've actually 3 questions on the normative position and then a few on the methodology. So this normative position is based on profound theological argumentation. I would like to ask you how the empirical research actually challenges or influences this theological reflection and this normative position. And I would like you to think in this regard about ways in which you can situate your answer in relation to the broader methodological reflections within the contemporary international field of practical theology, where we study practices not only to stimulate new practices, but also to challenge and to rethink theological aspects. So that's my first question.
Thank you, Professor Dillon. Thank you for the question. So, yeah, the relationship between the normative position and the empirical research and the results of the empirical research, how they interact. It's a good question, and it's a challenging question because it's a challenging process. I think right from the beginning, as has been mentioned already, we've gone through 7 trials of SPES, and each time, some of that is to make sure the statistical stability is there, but each time there's further reflections on the model and on the normative position. Along the way, in my just to give a personal response to this, on the way in my drafts, that normative position is moving around. As the feedback comes back through in discussions, visiting parishes, in meeting with people who have undertaken the surveys, so not just the empirical data from the results of the surveys, but also from returning to parish groups and sitting down with them and then explaining the model that they had no idea existed behind the questions they were asking, and listening to their response is constantly refining the normative position. I think it's an organic process. I don't think it will ever stop. However, I would also say that I don't think I think fundamentally the position of the engaged parish on theological grounds I would still hold to. I think the contributions that are made from the empirical might nuance that in some ways, but I still hold to that position. Yeah, is that great. Your question? Or? Yeah.
Well, a few other questions on this. The other question is whether it's adequate to speak about the normative position. So you recognize the value of other positions. And I agree, the engaged parish is the normative position, but I wonder whether you can really speak about something like the normative position. And I wonder whether this is a form of normativity for everyone or for every group in any situation, or whether you could imagine different forms of normativity. Or, in other words, are you not developing a theology or a theory about identity that considers identity of the parish here as something perfect, something with a focus on fulfillment and cohesion, while not giving enough attention to unfulfilled forms and fragmented parts of identity, to the brokenness found in daily parish life and to the value of this brokenness as well. So, asked in another way, is it is the normative you describe as an ideal, so of course rather than as a reality, actually helpful for people? And if you think that is, in what way then?
So maybe returning to the normative position and what is underlining, if I could answer the question in that way, what is underlining that normative position? Is the normative position as rosy and as ideal as perhaps you suggest? I'm not sure. I think the normative position, I would go back to underlining, I think in the thesis I did some broad perspectives on the shifts that happened in the major constitutions at Vatican II. So I'm thinking about Dei Verbum and a shift from a more proposition to a personal understanding of revelation. I'm thinking of Lumen Gentium and from the perfect society to the people of God. And I'm thinking of Gaudium et Spes from Christendom to a social imaginary that includes a place for the public place, for the market, for democracy, etc. So are there spaces in those normative positions for people to find their place, for people with their questions and with their doubts and with their particular place of where they are at this moment? I would say that in that normative position that there are. I would also perhaps look for the other quadrants, if you like, at the sometimes it's helpful to look at what's the dark side of that quadrant. What's the necrotic temptation there, if you like, for example, for the convinced parish to reify the doctrines and the teachings of the church in a way that doesn't have any interpretive hermeneutic, or for the devotional parish to reify the devotional and cultic practices in a way that seems that there is no mediation, that there's almost like a magical connection with God, or for the consumerist parish to reify so much the individual that they can be lost in relativism. I think the normative position there on the engaged in the engaged quadrant, backed by those shifts that I outlined from the constitutions, and then as I've tried to explore them, still for me provides the normative position for parishes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So then a third aspect in relation to the normative. So in line with other research using the post-critical belief skill and the dialogue school, you're criticizing the position of relativism and the value-based approach. I wonder whether it's not possible that by entering into dialogue with other forms of normative and formal theology, you could have evaluated the various positions in a different way. So, in other terms, can you describe which influences of formal theology you have integrated into your theology, and how these choices may have precluded other choices, and why? So, for instance, would a feminist theological position have stimulated you to focus more on flesh and body, on daily living, on ambiguity, for instance? And do you think that these aspects, to name just a few, could have changed your approach, or do you assert that these aspects are already integrated? In which case, your approach is even more synthetic than I discovered, I think.
Well, thank you for that very challenging question of integrating various perspectives on theology. Yeah. Well, if I reflect on if I reflect on the characteristics of each of the types, I think there is an attempt to try and cover a broad range. Of course, they're very brief. They're words or phrases, or but if I think from basic psychological value for each of the types, to try and understand from a psychological point of view how people are putting together their understanding of parish life and what effects that might have on it, right through to an inclusion of an attitude towards children, and then children as contributing to theological reflection and normativity. So those 20 characteristics from pneumatology, Christology, so forth. It's a very interesting question. I think it's a challenging question for me to try and further integrate perspectives from different aspects of theology. I think in exploring some of the types further. For example, I would try to have incorporate some liberation theology as well there. But it's a very good question.
That's helpful. So one more empirical question. So you worked with a quantitative empirical design, which cross-sectional research focused on finding associations or correlations between the various skills and instruments. Very interesting. We have heard that, and you've presented it in a wonderful way. But I wonder whether you could here explain for us all what other kinds of methods, quantitative or qualitative, you could have contributed to your research question, just in general.
Okay, some of the methods that I didn't use.
So, or why especially this one?
Okay, so your question, why this way? I understand.
Why not another way?
And why not another way? Well, I think the first spontaneous response is that the SPES was designed to assist in accompanying parishes who are already undertaking school identity self-reflection, and so to have some kind of synergy in approach was of course the first response, and that's a natural response. I think so we're working with models. We're working with models that never entirely exist in reality, both in SPES, in the Melbourne scale, in the Victoria scale. We're working with constructs and models, and I think the first thing that has to be done in each of those models is to ensure that the type actually holds together. So I think those the methodology of using seeking for internal consistencies is the first thing with models that makes sense to do, to make sure that it holds together. That the questions hold together in a way that makes sense and is understandable and that can be perceived and understood. The second approach empirically was then to look at whether these, so once we can establish that the questions hold together, do the factors, the 8 latent factors that we're looking for actually exist? And that has been a struggle through all the scales, but I think now it's very clear that we have statistically shown that those 8 latent structure factors have emerged and do exist. And then thirdly, empirically, as you mentioned, what we're looking for is associations then. And in the models are complex. In a sense that no one stands alone. So there are already there are internal correlations. So there is some correlation between engaged and convinced. There is some correlation between engaged and consumerist, and they logically make sense on the quadrants that the diagonally opposites don't have so many connections, but those next two do. So the internal correlations, and then the intercorrelations are looking for complex associations between the types. What other process could we have used? For example, something like regression analysis, but I think that's more looking for some stable factor that then can be measured against, cause and effect, for example. I think the correlations actually reveal a lot. I think the correlations have the potential for delving into the associations between the scales in a rich and a deeper way. I think still in my research there's lots of opportunities to look for further correlations. I didn't even begin to look at the background variable correlations with the scales, but it's possible to do that. So I think the methodology that we've undertaken was the appropriate one for the complexity of the scales that we're working with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Dillon. The Board of Examiners will now adjourn for deliberation. We will be back in about 15 minutes.
Sorry.
Examination for the degree of Doctor in Theology. Brendan Reed has defended a dissertation for the degree of Doctor in Theology, STD, entitled Engaging with the Hopes of Parishes, a systematic, empirical and practical search for a parish engagement scale, SPES. Having deliberated, the Board of Examiners has come to the following decision. Brendan Reed has completed the examination successfully and is therefore granted the degree of Doctor in Theology, STD. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Reed, dear Brendan, sincere congratulations at the completion of this doctoral project. You convincingly have shown it's easier to obtain a doctoral degree in Leuven than a master in advanced studies. You only needed 5 years for the doctorate, 13 years for the advanced master. However, this dissertation proves that also in 5 years you can offer a work of high quality, a work of rich originality. Moreover, this is a thesis with an impact. This is a relevant thesis. This is a thesis which will challenge all pastoral work in parishes. There was a time before and there will be a time after this thesis. This thesis was dealing with koinonia, diaconia, kerygma, liturgia, and all belong to the essence of Christian life and doctrine. They are an integral part of all Christians' life and all Christians' responsibility. I do consider it as one of the riches of this dissertation that it is written by an academically trained parish priest who combines research interests with real concern for the people of God. In the Laudatio, Professor Pollefeld said that everybody in Australia knows Brendan. Well, I dare to say that every cultural city and town in Europe is known by Brendan. And that Brendan is known in most of the Louvain restaurants and pubs. The promotion we celebrate today is the result of a long journey. In this regard, I am very grateful for the support as given by many. Archbishop Hart of Melbourne, Monsignor Doyle, the many friends of Brendan, the family, the parishioners. This dissertation can really be described as a process in which SPES, Fides, and Caritas were constantly accompanying the candidate. This is certainly also the case for the parishioners of Our Lady of Good Counsel of Dippendi. Dippendini, how do you pronounce it? Yeah, that's an impossible word. You have to change that. This is a good counsel. I wish to congratulate the promoter, Professor Pollefeld, who throughout the years has invested a lot of time and energy in this type of research. And I think that I can say he has now left for a while the schools. He crossed borders. He started a new career with this project. And it is clear that the project as developed in the schools is also relevant and important for the Christian communities as a whole. Many thanks to the correctors, especially to Professor Horner, who really made great efforts to critically contribute to the enhancement of this dissertation. Many thanks also to the Leuven readers, who were both interested because of their own research and responsibilities, and precisely therefore were also critically engaging you in this process. The promotion is a moment full of symbols. One of the moments is the handing over of the statue of the Sede Sapientiae to the new doctor. I feel honored to hand over our Sede Sapientiae to a parish priest of the parish Our Lady of Good Counsel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Given the fact that Dr. Reed is also a parish priest, he wants to have the last word.
Just a few words of thanks as we conclude. First of all, I'd like to thank my correctors, Professor Horner, Dillon, and Steen, for constructively reading and engaging with my text. Your feedback and engagement with SPES and pushing it further will make it a better project into the future. So thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to thank my promoter, Didier Pollefeld. In Australia, most universities still use the word supervisor. But there's something different about promoter. A promoter is supportive, nurturing, encouraging, celebrating with one's colleagues. And Didier has been a fantastic promoter in so many ways. I've thoroughly enjoyed working with you, Didier, and our collaboration, as you mentioned earlier, goes back for many years, and I hope will continue for many more years. Thank you for promoting me and for the friendship that's developed during that time. To the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, thank you to Professor Lambrix, Dean of the Faculty, for presiding here today, and for the long association dating back 18 or 19 years. I would never correct the Dean, but I have not been enrolled for 13 years in the Advanced Masters. But it did take 13 years to get. Professor Lambrix has been supportive of every initiative put forward by the Archdiocese of Melbourne, the Catholic Education Melbourne, and he's a valued partner and friend in our Archdiocese. To other members of the faculty, Emeritus Professor Herman Lombards, my first promoter in the first Masters that only took 1 year, thank you for being here today and for your support through all those years. To Jan Bowens, and indeed the EXI team here with you today. Jan, thank you for your invaluable support and advice along the way. To Imke Bave, who has been my conduit and my voice often in the Flemish parishes. Imke, thank you for your dedication and your support and your belief in this project. To Jan Verkoen and the team who I presume without a hitch streamed this event around the world. Thank you. To the parishes, priests and staff of the Flemish parishes who helped and participated, and particularly Mrs. Ria Ombelets, who is here today. Thank you for the enormous support that you gave for that to happen. In Australia, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Archbishop Dennis Hart for his ongoing support and commitment to me and to researching Catholic institutional identity. He continues to support that year after year. To Stephen Elder and the staff at Catholic Education Melbourne for their support and for Steve's ongoing commitment to supporting and funding research. To Monsignor Doyle, who's never lost his passion for education, research and the church. And Tom has inspired, encouraged and supported at least 2 generations, maybe 3, of priests and laity to pursue their hopes and dreams in study and pastoral activity. He's also a promoter of a kind, a moderator and a mentor, and in many ways the father, not grandfather, of EXI and SPES. Thank you to my close friends, Frank O'Loughlin, Kevin Lenahan, Joe Caddy, for their ongoing support. Thank you to the parishes who participated in SPES, and to my own parish of Deepdene and Balwyn, who Kevin Lenahan unkindly said recently I'd been there for 5 out of the 10 years that I have been parish priest, for their incredible support during the time of this research. Particularly, I'd want to thank Tricia Norman and Kate Baines. To the friends in Flanders, to Jeroen and Serge and Tom and Eve and Woody, who have always been so welcoming and supportive and looked after me when I've been here. Finally, to my family, to my dad, I don't know if he watched a live stream, to my siblings who know me probably better than anyone else, for their love and support, particularly for Chris, who's been here for the last 2 weeks, suffering me, and to Angela, who flew in just yesterday to be here today. Thank you, everyone. I hope you can join for a reception immediately following in the Rector's Salon on the ground floor today. Thank you. Okay, we should do it.